It's on them to provide a safe mechanism. Uh, in my opinion, Vircadia does not need to be, controlling DRM, and it does not need to be in that place. And so there are certainly other mechanisms for dealing with that kind of thing that do not have to put Vircadia in that place. For example, uh, you know, I have a T-shirt that I'm selling, and somebody's purchased that, and then I realized there's somebody else who's doing that T-shirt, but they've changed the design of my T-shirt a little
Thanks, your
bit,
mic.
and they put something on there. Well, that means they had to get their hands on it somehow. So, it as a creator, I own the rights to that, um, and I can certainly, validate that I created it first, just like any musician would validate that, they wrote that piece of music first. There's a history, and so it would be upon them to, first of all, go to the vendor that they're dealing with who sold it for them, and complain that there's an issue, and then they can go to that person who's using that and say, hey, that is my product right there, and legally you cannot wear that. I mean, it's up to them to, and if it's a, you know let's say that T-shirt cost $1,000, and certainly, I mean, there are people that are selling digital products out there for astronomical prices, and people are buying them. I don't know why, but if then there's actually a real damage, and I can pursue that person legally, um, for stealing my content. So it's just it's not upon Vircadia. Vircadia is just providing a platform for people to communicate on. So, okay, next slide, please. Users not get what they did not pay for. It's the same thing. It's up to the vendor to ensure that only people who have paid for a product or service are getting it. Next slide. Okay, so what hooks? Well, to me, hooks are need to um, to help the vendor solve two problems. Like, who is this? Because they can't lock up their products if they don't know who they're dealing with. And is this their product or service? Next slide. So, who is this? So, basically, I think at the very minimum, that Vercadia needs a way for to provide a user's ID, their UID, which I think is safer than using their username, because if if they know your username, then they could use a rainbow table or something to try to crash, or try to log in as you and assume your identity. So using the user ID would be a safer way of transmitting that information so that it cannot be stolen, so that their identity cannot be stolen. So so I propose that that is the only information that we really need to provide the vendor. And there's two ways it needs to be transmitted. One is uh, when interest in the product or the sale of the product happens, and two, when the vendor should be able to come back through some kind of mechanism, and query um, Vircadia if this connection that's being made is this actually the this identity, so that that way there can't be some man in the middle kind of thing going on. Yeah, right. Display name does not equal username. Yeah, but that we don't want to give them their display name because the display name changes, right? Because I mean, like today, Kalila is Wafology and Wafuology, and tomorrow she could be Kalila again. So that we cannot use that information. It's got to be a static information in the metaverse database that we can provide to the vendor. Next, next slide, please. Okay, so here's my kind of my diagram is how I would handle this. Now, when you provide a link to somebody to let's say a particular file, and I could write, so that when somebody asks for a FST, for example, I'm not too sure what the limits are for for how we can call items from within um, Vircadia. But let's say I know it's an FST, right? Well, programmatically, if I point that FST to my website can say, oh, they're asking for if that particular FST, and there'd be some kind of nomenclature or something in that, and then maybe um, also we can pass on a parameter which would be the user's ID, and so then I could match and say, well, okay, um, does this does this when I ingest it, that request, I say, is this FST, does it belong to that user ID? Is that a product that they've paid for? And that information should be in my database already. Um, so in this example right here, you see that we got the user on the left-hand side, comes in the interface, right? They click on they are in a particular domain, right? And in that domain, you see that there's that little cog right there, right? That's a button. They just clicked on it. I want to purchase a product or a service, right? So if you follow that kind of that gold lead there, then it comes back to the vendor, and we've got the UID and product information that is passed on to the vendor. Okay, at the same time, though, a browser pop up for payment, and of course, any kind of information or flow of requested information can happen right here. The basic idea is that is a link, a web entity that was provided from the vendor's web page, and when they click through that, it's going to go to a payment gateway. I personally like Stripe. I think that their rates are better, and I think that they've got a more modern API for handling problems, and I've used them in the past. So that's probably what I would do, and then they would send me a response or request. So you see where that gold and that green connects, this is okay, transaction completed, right? So then once that happens, that light green shows that their access is approved and they get access to that product or service. And then of course this is stored in the database so whenever they try to use that product or service, if they bought a product from us, then they can continue getting that product because without having to go through the payment, because we have them stored in our database. So that's kind of my the workflow that I propose that I'm going to use. And in this situation, all I need to do is to be able to verify that user ID. I don't have to require Vircadia to provide anything else to me other than being able to verify that user for me, either in an async way or some other manner, which I'm sure the devs would have to really ponder upon how to do that. Okay, next slide. Discussion. All right, and that's my idea. That's what I think. What do you guys think?
Oh, perfect. I actually have a question.
Oh, sorry, before we get into the question, Hap, I think I accidentally skipped this one slide when we went from the user example to is this their product or service, or do you need to go over this, or did you kind of cover it already here?
I kind of covered it. The basic idea is that that Vircadia does not need to perform any DRM. This is upon
Right.
the vendor to handle. And I explained to you guys the way that I would handle it is that whatever product or service, I would ingest that information and check it against my database to determine whether or not they had access, and then I would want to query um, Vircadia to ensure that the user that I'm talking to is the same user that bought that product.
Thanks. Go ahead, Aitola.
Yeah, so maybe this was, but I didn't really have time to truly absorb it. But okay, so one of the things we have is that anyone can create a metaverse with this software, right? So are we going by the assumption that this is that identifier that they would verify is one metaverse at a time? Okay, so what if, for example, we have this Vircadia metaverse here. What if I created the Beneverse, and it's the same software and everything over here, and I've bought some products on, I will say Turbo Squid or whatever, and they're using the API. Is there
Right.
any kind of identifier that could be carried across between metaverses?
Well, see, and that's where the discussion with Mr. Blue comes in. With what he's
Mm-hmm.
trying to work out is to have that all the different metaverses would actually be part of a kind of a grid, and that they would
Yeah.
share information. And of course, if we had OAuth between all these, then one user from one can go to the other, and when they query the database, or when they query the vendor, they're going to be a Tola at Vircadia, or they're going to be a Tola at whatever metaverse, but
Mm-hmm.
that information would follow because they are authenticating, um, you know, through that federated service. Does that make sense?
Excellent. I have a fire alarm. I have to go. I'll be back.
Oh, okay.
So I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say the account ID, you wanted to use that instead of a username. You're not expecting the account ID to be private, though, are you? Because that is public knowledge. Like, the metaverse does let people know what your account ID is, I believe, or it's one way or another to get it. But you're just basically using it so that's a unique identifier in case that their username is ever changed, that it still works, right?
Right, right. That's why the UID would probably be the best mechanism. One thing, it is kind of analogous that the vendor doesn't really care who the user is. They just want to make sure that the person who bought that product can access it. So how much information the vendor wants to keep is up to them. In my mind, the least, the less likely that they can run into problems of leakage of PII, um, personally identifiable information. So um, yeah, and of course with in federated systems that they can leave a lot of those worries and concerns with whoever's creating that information to begin with.
All right. Oh, and one other thing is that I agree with your point about the browsers, that as long as that's secure, then we don't really have to worry about anything. So I believe we tested it once when talking about SWIA and NDN World. Does the data in one browser become accessible in another? And I believe the answer was no. Recently, I opened a PR that makes many changes to that, so I really suggest giving that a test. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, you might want to test that PR and make sure that our previous assumptions are still true. And if they are, then we should be good to go.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, well, if you think about it, if it's opening up in the context of my interface, unless I'm sharing that browser with everybody else, they can't see what I'm typing, right? I mean, because we can obviously we're sharing a browser right here, so but that's a different mechanism. Am I correct?
Yeah, this is a WebRTC.
Right.
So but like the screens behind us on the wall, the presentations on the walls, you can go ahead and click those and go through the slides and stuff, but everybody else still sees their own view of it.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, for example, I mean, when you click on any of our things that are in our menu bar here, it's opening up basically a web entity, and so the same difference, right? That's Chrome based? Am I correct in saying
Yeah.
that? Yeah. So, and people can't see what I'm clicking. They can't see what I'm doing. That's not really shared because it's all happening locally on my machine, unless it's changing objects or things that are viewable to the rest of the world, and then they can see the results, but they can't see my actual actions. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's a such thing as keyloggers, etc., but I don't, I don't envision
Yeah,
that
but
being a
that
problem
keylogger
just
would
yet.
have to be, yeah, the keylogger would have to be on your machine. So you must have
True.
installed it somehow.
Well,
So
there is the
I
idea of
don't.
malicious scripts and overlays and people trying to do things that way, but
Hmm,
I don't believe that would be a problem just yet. But it would be good to build the system out in a way that prevents that kind of thing from
right,
happening. So like a secured browsing context might be interesting. Like a
right.
browser that launches from a secure API in which no script can attach to and nothing can be overlaid on top of it, for example. So that way you know it's real.
So what do you think the possibility? Because I mean, in any domain, the owner of that domain would have to allow a vendor to actively sell things. Doesn't mean that people can't access things that they bought or purchased outside of that domain, but they would definitely need, permission to sell things in a domain. How easy is it for a? Because I'm not, I haven't really been developing for Vircadia, so these sound like newbie questions. Um, but how easy is it for a vendor to have their own JavaScript, their own scripts that nobody else can see, but others can act upon, by executing them?
Well, JavaScript doesn't really work that way. Like, you have to see it and have it in order for it to work. I mean, the most people ever do is minify it, right? So it looks kind of odd, but you can still decompile it and still look at it. Or
Right, but that's
deminify.
if it's running in. That is if it's running in a browser that you have access to where you can use tools to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, if we're I mean, for example, um, well, it makes sense that it can't act upon me or I can't act with it if I can't see it.
Wait, I
So
have.
that
Wait, why are you asking that specifically? Like,
well,
why
I'm
would I
just
want
wondering,
to
how
hide
much.
JavaScript? That's a good question, I think.
I'm just wondering when people create scripts on the back end for
Mm-hmm.
like maybe for for buttons and things like that. Um, how much people can see. I don't know because I haven't set anything up. What kind of issues or problems that might present. Um, but I think that generally just providing a link for somebody to get a pop up to
Mm-hmm.
make a purchase, that won't be a problem
No,
because it's
no. Well,
because everything's that yeah, that pop up is coming from an external website. It's the transactions are made with a payment gateway.
mm-hmm.
Um, everything's done through SSL, so I think all that kind of stuff is pretty safe.
Yeah, pretty much. You're just sending them to a link. So when I was talking about overlays, um, the real problem is that a hacker might do is it's like on gas pumps when they they attach a card reader to it. You know, the gas pump looks real, everything is real, but all they did is overlaid their fake card reader on top of it that takes your card info, right? Um, so it's a similar thing here. If you have a really,
Right.
really popular domain that sells thousands of avatars a day, for example, it might be in a hacker's best interest to come in and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to create a fake overlay that attaches to people, or at least, acts like it is the thing when you launch it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but good enough to where the person doesn't really realize, enters all their info, and, well, there it is. The money goes to their account instead of yours. So that's, I guess, a worry I have, but that would probably be
Hmm.
solved by a secure context because if everyone's interface launches a context that can't have any overlays on top of it, then there would be really
Right.
no way for a hacker to do that other than distributing a hacked client. And well, if you're using a hacked client,
Right.
then that was your responsibility, not ours. So,
Right. Right. That's what I thought, but those are good problems to explore.
hmm
And I think that maybe what we ought to do is, just try to set up a number of different kinds of things that vendors might want to do, and then just like have a hackathon,
yeah, well,
you know,
they will need
and
access to
just
the
see who.
Metaverse API, right? Like API calls.
Who will need those?
The vendor, right? So they can ask questions and verify and
So will they get that from the metaverse, or will they get that from the domain?
see that's I suppose a vendor should partner with a metaverse or metaverses, right? So they should like
Right.
have an account there and then they would be able to perform requests for their application, right? Because then you could just talk directly to the metaverse. I feel like that
Right.
makes sense.
That would be probably the safest, and not only that, it's safest for the consumer because Joe Plant can't come and just start creating stuff. Even if if a domain owner says, yeah, you can do that, but this person really has malicious intents.
Hmm.
You can't by making sure that somebody validates who these people are. I think does kind of add some, I think it's due diligence on the part of Vircadia and on the part of the metaverse owners to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, perhaps.
Can I ask some? Sorry, I'm pretty slow here with the vendor part of it. So the vendor is like another third party, and this is somebody who maybe wants to create their own store and sell their own items. It's an individual, and they want to set up their own kind of like service, I would say. Is that right? So we're creating like a vendor spec, a vendor API that they can integrate with domain servers to sell things.
Correct.
Okay. And they manage a product database in their backend. We can even give them an implementation for which they can do that. And then keep this sort of, we know who bought what, when, and there's the initial delivery of the digital item to the person
Right.
somehow.
Right.
After that item has been delivered, I think you said before, there's no DRM associated with this. So how that person takes that and uses that is that going to be up to the vendor or up to the domain server, like how where it's
That's
hosted? And
Yeah. That's up to that is a consideration that's made between the owners of the data and the vendor and the purchasers of the data, because they could be three different entities involved in this. For example, let's just talk about my use case. Okay, I'm creating avatars which anybody can use freely, right? However, you don't want to be walking around and then you're talking to Kalela over here, and then here comes Kalela walking by, and it's the same avatar, and you're like, well, am I talking to Kalela or not? So you do want some kind of integrity there. So the way that I would handle that is using that Commerce API to validate the the person that I'm talking to, that's talking to my server, so that when I deliver that content to them, I can ensure that that's them. And there's also another layer that I can do, and I've done it before using Amazon S3. So when you call for a product and I deliver it to you, I can time that out so that every time you're going to get a fresh key when you get it. So let's just say somebody did get access to that key and they thought, now I could go get that item from Haptic Monkeys S3. Well, no, they can't do that because the link is timed out. So there's a number of tricks that can be done from the vendor side to, I don't want to say it's absolutely perfect. And when it comes down to it, the person that really has a beef about DRM is the person who owns the product. And if there is some, and this is just me, other people might feel differently about this, but if there is some kind of egregious violation to where it's causing me serious fiscal harm, then I have legal options that I can take. Otherwise, it's just irritating. That makes sense?
yeah, you're delegating the responsibility, that DRM, to the vendors themselves, and they can choose. They can choose to, try to do some kind of scheme, like you said, URL timeouts or something like that, to and validations every so often, such that the avatar in the domain can continue to wear or use those items, or they could just make it completely open, put their stuff on S3, and they don't care if people copy it. Maybe their sales won't be
Absolutely.
as high. you know,
Absolutely.
because people just copy it. So it's kind of like it'll be a self-discovery there of what is the right, depending upon the population that starts coming into these domains, you know, how they want to manage it. But I like that it delegates the DRM to them. That's smart.
Yeah, I think that Vircadia does not need to be in that. Being an open platform, we just need to provide the tools for people to do what they want to do, and there's some limit, and we're not going to try to meet the whim of everyone unless there's a consensus somewhere that this needs to be done. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah, I think a way to asynchronously, if I'm saying that right, to verify the user's identity who's making requests. I think that that's the golden ticket right there for the vendor.
One thing I don't get is in the avatar case, a user's bought the avatar and wears it, visits a domain with other users in it. Now, those other users also need to be able to grab the avatar model so that they can see it.
Oh no, that's interesting thoughts because how is that done to the mixer? See, there's just my ignorance here. Is I thought that the user that is wearing that item that's handled at the mixer level, right?
Well, the URL is handled at the mixer level, but where the model is actually hosted is uh, up up to the user, really, up to the
Right,
user who's
right.
wearing the avatar.
Well, like in my case, right, that I would provide the storage on my S3, right, and that would be behind a private S3 bucket. And basically, when somebody comes to when they use my link, the link doesn't go to the bucket; it goes to my website, and I digest that link, and then I provide them an FST that's going to have links to the S3 bucket with keys that expire. So if it can make it um, to the mixer, then there shouldn't be any problem, as far as I understand. I have to play with this. I have to figure out how to make this
But
work. That's just
but
my
if the
idea.
but if the data expires when somebody shows up and it has expired already, they won't see the avatar.
Hmm.
well, there is something that can and maybe should be done long term. It's that um, I actually commented out the auto delete code. I didn't actually remove it from the domain servers and the mixers. Um, so it's entirely possible that domains can still partner with vendors, right? Databases to uh, wipe content that is infringing, for example. This is something voluntary on the basis of the domain servers and the vendors, but if, for example, someone copies the avatar to use it as their own, the domain server knows that because the mixer is the one, routing all that, so they know that this person has this avatar, and maybe they're not supposed to. So the domain server can choose to say, hey, we're going to reject that based on what the vendor told us. But it has nothing to do with, say, the Vircadia metaverse, and it's not innately programmed into domain servers. It's more like a federation kind of thing. And the reason why that might work is because everything is a value proposition, right? So who cares if someone steals your avatar and then goes sits in an offline world for 10 years? No one cares. You're not losing anything, no social capital either. Um, but if like the biggest worlds, for example, have filters in place, then if someone takes your content, they have even less impact on your economy and your social capital for avatars, because there's no one to show it to, there's no one to interact with it to, because then the server is automatically handling that for you. You see, the thing about
Right,
piracy is you can never prevent it ever. It's impossible. But what you can do is mitigate its effects by increasing and
right.
decreasing value in different areas.
I think if that works, that sounds like a really good idea. Um, and
Theoretically.
probably once I get to a point where I have a website where we want to begin to play with those things, we can test this out. I mean, we can test this whole paradigm out, and we can write up, some kind of pages for vendors, who want to use their, create their own commerce API for how they want to do things.
Mm-hmm. She could work, yeah. But I figure that's like a good long-term solution. Short term is making sure that the items just get delivered to the right place, and that's a good
Right,
start, especially when you're
right,
small.
right. Well, I mean, in my case, I'm creating avatars that people wear for free. I'm not really too worried about, whether other people are wearing them. But like you said, in the future, social capital is going to be important. So, you don't want other people wearing a likeness of you, especially if I'm really successful at, creating a mechanism for people to copy their faces. I want it to look like me, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and so you don't want people running around with your face, right? It's just kind of offensive.
Yep.
So,
So we discourage
per,
that, right? By like making sure that
right,
all the important places where they would even benefit from stealing your identity are off limits to them.
right, right, right. So I think that's a really good idea. We need to explore that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But
Good way to
when I
remove
start
the.
selling, in my paradigm, people will be able to upload their own clothing that they want to sell, right? And I just provide a marketplace for them to do that in. So in that case, then yeah, we're more concerned that people can steal that and be wearing something that they didn't pay for, and this person who put the sweat into creating that object for people isn't getting compensated for it.
Hmm.
So
Well, a quick.
that's more of a concern.
Well, there's one quickie that you could do, which is make sure that the clothing is applied at avatar creation time. Now, of course, eventually somebody could still rip out a piece of clothing and try and soft attach it somehow afterwards, right? But if the clothing is baked into the avatar during its creation in Make Avatar, then
Right.
it's a pretty good security so far.
Well, I can see that it would be possible to actually exchange the clothing, like to have a virtual clothing closet where I paid for this clothing, I'll see my clothing, and I can change my clothing without totally re-resing my avatar.
Ah, well, that's definitely
And that's
possible.
kind of that's kind of a vision. Oh, I think you can do it because if I can attach things, you realize I'm using um, 3GAS and everything I'm doing is it's in the browser. It's web based.
Yeah.
So if I can if I can attach those things to the avatar that somebody's wearing, um, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Oh well, some of these things are dreams. We'll see. We'll see if we get there.
I don't know about dreams. It seems like it's already possible. The
I
Commerce
think it
API,
is
however, we gotta
possible.
like do a little work there. But
Right.
a good next step, I think, for Commerce API though is now that we've outlined a higher level of okay, here's what vendors and people might want, then we should like write down some fake API calls. Here are API calls in the interface, here are the API calls in the domain server, here are the APIs on the metaverse, and here are some dummy endpoints on the vendor's side. And so we
Hmm.
can kind of map out how this might be implemented. That might be a good next step.
Yep. I like that.
And then and then actually try it out on Hap's avatar business.
Right. Well, for the first thing we're going to do is just allow people to select their avatars in world, and hopefully they can res them, straight from the interface in world. Um, and then, of course, they could always go to the website, generate a URL, and then paste that into their avatar thing. But it'd be great if all this could be done in world without ever having to, to leave their environment.
I agree that would be a big draw.
Yeah, oh well, we could have transparent web panels. You can just put the avatar creator in there. That's
Mm-hmm.
seamless.
Mm-hmm.
That could work. Have you thought about the preferred payment system to use for like a first go, like Stripe,
Well, I'm going to use Stripe. I'm
Coffee?
going to use Stripe. I know Stripe.
Hmm.
I think Stripe is um, it's the API is miles farther than PayPal, and their payment structure, you're actually making more money.
Okay.
So, and they also have cool features. Let's say a domain owner said, "Well, yeah, you can sell stuff uh, in my in my domain. However, I want a tax. I want 2% of everything that you sell. That's all. I'm just asking for 2%. That's not too much. I mean, I've got to pay for the bandwidth. I've got to pay for. So if you're going to make money here, I need to make something too. And
Hmm.
so with Stripe, you can make that automatic. So you can split those little things up to where he gets like 2% off the top on every transaction, and then I can take some off the top, and then the rest can go to the creator of the product.
Sounds about right. So Stripe's APIs are really easy to use. I mean, that's like the number one thing. If you ask people
I
to
think they're easy to use.
start a business in VR, you're gonna want to hopefully make it be a low barrier to entry.
Right. I personally, I've done a lot of development. I've written a lot of stuff in PHP, but as far as I wouldn't say I'm a high level programmer. I see a lot of programmers who write some really complicated, wild looking code. You could read my code like it's a book. Okay, I'm very
Hmm.
functional in the way that I write code, and so with that in mind, I was able to use this API, and so um, I think it's easy. Yeah, I think it's really easy. I think it's very easy to use. It's a paradigm like any other. It can be as simple as hard as you make it, though.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. We're abstracting the payment provider. So we're writing like a neutral payment provider interface or API that could, and maybe the perfect example implementation is to make sure it works with Stripe. But I mean, we're not writing something specifically for Stripe, right?
Well, actually, it's up to the vendor to choose what payment
Exactly.
gateway
Yeah.
they
So
use. And so
yep.
when somebody, let's say I'm selling a widget, right? And somebody clicks on a button, that button is a link to my website, and it's going to pop up a payment window, which is it's tied to whatever gateway that I'm using. You see, so either if I could be my own gateway of my own making, or it can be a gateway like Stripe or PayPal or something like that. So we don't, Vircadia is not creating any kind of way for us to do that. That's completely on the vendor to create that interface for the user. All that all that I in my mind. Now, of course, you might come up with a much better way, and you probably will. But in my mind, the only thing that Vircadia has to provide is an asynchronous way to verify users.
So like that.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
But how do you provide an asynchronous way to verify users and not make it vendor specific?
Well, because the
Through the
vendor,
metaverse.
is the entity that's selling the product, right?
Oh,
And the
sorry. Yeah,
vendor
that's right.
and the vendor is creating the content to sell that product on Vircadia. So, and would provide buttons or a page or something that is going to be protected through SSL.
I got the perfect example. Okay, so imagine Firefox is Vircadia, and then you go to bestbuy.com and you try to buy a laptop. That's the vendor. when you hit check out and you choose checkout with PayPal, a pop-up for PayPal opens. That's the payment provider. When you enter all your information and
Absolutely.
pay, that gets sent back to the vendor. When the vendor gets all the information, they ship out the laptop. Laptop gets to you. That's your product. You see? It's exact same model. Exact same thing.
It's the exact same model.
Yeah.
Yes. The only difference is that you synchronously verify that the user that you're talking to is who they say they are, so so that you can provide the product in the world
Yeah, so like the
or
vendor
service.
verifies you're you and then says, okay, now here is your payment token. Go pay. Come back with us. Come back to us, after you've paid. And then, okay, yeah, we know you've paid. We can associate these two identities, the payment with your account on BestBuy.com. All right, now we'll ship it off to you. So it all happens in the vendor side of things. The vendor's responsible for figuring that stuff out. So we just got to give them the API endpoints to perform those verifications if needed.
Right. And it only becomes a problem, when you're dealing with money, or if you're if you're trying to provide some kind of digital rights for your customers. Because my customers aren't going to be people who use my avatars. They're free, right? So I mean, I do care that they're protected, but I'm more concerned about people who need to have the surety that the products that they sell on my site are going to be protected in some way from piracy. And when it comes down to ultimately, in my user agreement is that I will make best effort, but it's ultimately up to the end user to pursue it if pirating happens. It's not. I'm not going to be their legal team.
That's true. You might, as a vendor, you might want to look into how CG Trader and Adobe Stock handle it. Though they are big companies, so they probably have money to at least perform some level of assurance. But I don't think so, because I don't think they even think about DRM at that level. They're just thinking about if people want to use this in a business case, they're not going to risk their business by pirating. They're going to pay for the license, and if someone's not paying for a
Right.
license, they're probably not doing anything valuable. So big deal. That's
Right.
usually how they roll with it.
Exactly. Yep.
So, in effect, work through HAP's use case, provide general Vircadia hooks for things like user identity and perhaps verify and altering product URLs in the domain server, and try it out and see what we can do and come up against.
Now there are other things that Arcadia could do. For example, if I were to create a HTTPS link, um, and it went to some site, Vircadia could probably check that SSL certificate to make sure it's valid. So that way, only valid SSL certificates can be used. I think that would be kind of like due diligence. So that might be
Mm-hmm.
something that the API could handle.
Well, I feel like that can
Mm-hmm.
and is implemented at the direct QT level. And, SSL is usually verified by the web engines themselves. It's not even something we have to deal with. It usually will, like, we
So
could
does
set
it
a
pop
strict
up
mode
and
or
say
not,
you?
but
Yeah, does it pop up and say you are trying to access a page that is not secure, but has
possibly should.
yeah?
We'd have to
It's
set
just
like
a
a strict
question.
mode or something. Basically, what I'm saying is like it's not an API thing, but more like parameters, just to configure it to say, hey, reject insecure connections or something.
Well, and that could be that could be a toggle that that a vendor could use, because if a
Mm-hmm.
vendor doesn't need a secure link, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know, because that doesn't really quite protect the user, does it?
No,
So
but
I guess we can
if
make
they
a
want to decide.
determination if yeah, we need to make a determination of how much we're wanting to protect the end user from the world.
Well, what you can do is have a pop-up that says, hey, you're going to access an insecure link, right? If you want to proceed, fine. If not, back out. And the vendor can put a note in World saying, hey, we use an insecure link right now, don't worry about it. And then that's their responsibility. Just how it is, it's
Yeah, I
how it
think
needs to
that
be.
David had a good point. Is that we should at least be able to allow the user to view that certificate before they try to access a link.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So just kind of like have a little world, or maybe a little lock emblem on it that might be unlocked or locked, and let people kind of like in the browser, right? And let people look at certificates and say, is this somebody I really, honestly, I want to guess that 75 to 80% of the public aren't even aware how that works. So
Well, we could say, hey, this looks safe, hey, this doesn't look safe. I mean, that's what browsers usually do. They give you a green lock if it's good and they don't even bother you. But if there's something
right,
off or suspicious, it becomes yellow or even red. And then it says, hey, this is not secure. What do you want to do about it?
right, right. Yeah, I think Control David's got the right idea. Just some visual indicator.
Yep, which shouldn't be too tricky. I think the tricky part might be trying to see how to get a web context to render on top of everything else. Purely because I haven't tried it yet. So.
Well, did we beat that horse?
No, we gotta be some more later.
Okay.
But I mean, really, and then I think next steps, like in terms of homework, should be what APIs do we want to see in the interface, domain server, metaverse API, and vendor, so that way we can visualize it in like stage 2 of evolution of like creation, and see what this actually
Right.
looks like. What does this diagram look like when brought to life, and what will we need to program? So I talk about
Yep.
secure browsing context. So that's one API. But then what else is there? So we need APIs for the vendors to be able to communicate and ask who's who, which I think there's already APIs in the metaverse, obviously, to check on information for users, but I'm sure that the vendors want something specific to know to be sure about the person. So maybe session IDs. Like the domain server is reporting a session ID, and the metaverse knows this user has a session ID, so that person must be that person.
I like that. And that even will work in a federated sense,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Because you have to
Because
get it from the
if
domain
I'm in
server
somebody,
and the metaverse.
absolutely, absolutely. What probably becomes a little bit more difficult is for the vendor that has to be aware somehow, and it's up to the vendor to figure this out, but it has to be aware of all the different metaverses, you know, unless part of that matrix, that the vendor can become part of that matrix. That's an idea.
Possibly. I mean, the idea of federation, though, is that you make an account on one, and then your instance will communicate with all the others. So what you would want to do is kind of set up your vendor in like the Switzerland of metaverses that will basically do trade with anyone, right? So if I have a metaverse account on that metaverse, then all of a sudden when I send a request to them and the account isn't there, what that metaverse API will do is start branching out and start searching all the other metaverses, searching the tree, looking for that account. And then once they do, and if they are partnered with that metaverse, they'll be able to get the information for you. I imagine that's
Right.
how Federation works as it is on the internet.
I'm wondering if in this paradigm, if a user from another metaverse um, successfully authenticates into a domain, if the domain that they're going into, if that their metaverse keeps a record of that individual. In other words, they get No, we don't want them to have a UID though, do we? Just wondering, because what if in this situation somebody purchased a product who is from the Bodoc metaverse, so it's 7785 at Bodoc metaverse. That metaverse goes down, so
Mhm.
this person cannot use their product. I can't go to another metaverse because they can't authenticate for me, right? Because my metaverse doesn't exist anymore. That
Ah,
makes
it's one of those
sense.
tricks. I mean, you can't
I
verify a
I
person.
know people that are interested to solve this issue already with Vircadia, like they would help to integrate that stuff, but that's still a bit of like we kinda in talks with them, but we need to further Vircadia first, and they need to finish their stuff. Then there
That
is
sounds good.
cross metaverse compatibility shouldn't be really an issue anymore.
Right. Yeah, that would be a consideration though for the vendor who's trying to keep a track and a record of, people that are using their good or services.
Hmm. Well, think about it. Like, you can't log in, you can't access your items. That's kind of how it is now, right? You can't if you can't log into the metaverse that your account's at, then well, obviously you can't get your
Sorry, I think I
items.
missed some of that because I was AFK
You
there.
start putting tic-tac-toe on the board.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, you know what? I win. What?
And just a call out. I put Hap's presentation on the wall in the back there. So if you guys want to reference it further or look through it again, feel free. It's right below the Zoom presentation.
Nice.
Yeah, one of the good things of having like a room like this, we can keep some persistence of our discussions.
That's funny.
What? What? No, I didn't do that though. That's cheating. I didn't play that move. Dang it.
Noah John, did you just? Okay.
No, it wasn't me. It was
Gosh
someone
darn
else.
you guys. Alright,
I would
well,
enjoy that.
thank
But
you, Hap, for
the
putting on
question
the
is,
presentation.
who's going to run these vendors if it does happen?
Yeah, thanks very much, Hep. That's great.
That's a good question. That's the whole idea. We don't know.
Wait, who's gonna run vendors? I don't understand.
Whoever the vendor is.
Yeah, I thought.
Yeah, you know.
We're opening
Yeah.
the doors for people to be able to like actually do their own thing. Okay, do you remember when Second Life had all sorts of vendors that came in? Like there was X Street,
Yeah,
there was
there
the
was.
SL Exchange, and there was a couple of others.
SL Exchange got bought by Second Life, then they integrated it, I think.
Yep.
Sure,
But
but
I'm not
like
sure
forget
about
what
others.
happened eventually. But like at the beginning, because the way it was designed, multiple vendors were able to come in and provide, services like that.
Yeah.
So I think that part was good. I don't know, but
I
unfortunately, yeah, it did end up getting all
think
bought up by SL.
this could possibly work in here. I'm just, unless we can get people in here, that's the issue. Yeah. I don't see why not.
Well, the more vendors, in my mind, the better. I mean, when you
Mhm.
have when you have vendors who are selling stuff, it becomes interesting. People say, "Hey, that's something I could use," or "I sure like that," and then you
It's
have
kind of
people.
it's kind of interesting because you said you want to have an upgrade and a better graphics engine in here, but it could depend on how the details work in here also and all that stuff. So far, someone made some shader lights. I think that was Phil's. That was amazing.
There's plenty of room for improvement, but like,
Yeah.
I mean, we're
I'm too
kind of
worried.
using the Unreal. The shader is similar to the Unreal shader as far as
Is it?
like that we're using the roughness, metallic, diffuse, occlusion. Yeah, like so it's kind of a standard right now as far as shaders go. But what we don't have is we don't have like a good LOD system yet. We don't have volumetrics, which would like add a whole nother level. Lighting can be improved, all sorts of things. But like what we do have so far, at least, is modern with the components we have.
Yeah.
Especially now that we've integrated like GLTF and such.
Well, I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is that once we open up the door,
Are you taking off him?
Holy shit.
Hello.
Oh my god, what's that?
What's
What?
that, you know?
Well, what?
Please, we're now
the-
boarding at gate 23.
okay. The
It's
point
power
is
crash
that
intensity.
once there's people that are making money, there's a likelihood that they're going to want to fund development in Vircadia.
That's
Because
true.
they want Vircadia to be very successful, because that makes them successful.
Yepers. We just gotta keep our edge. We'll keep providing value.
Oh, I know I'll be sticking around long enough here anyway.
I think we've kind of proven that those of us are here in for the long haul.
Throw you off the edge.
What? You can't.
Throw-
You're like 2 feet tall.
Oh, there's a window. Oh shit, there's a window there. Oh fuck. Oh well.
This murderous duck.
Safety feature. Yes.
Yeah, toddlers can't reach
Someone
over
remove
it,
it, would
as you
you?
can see.
Fucking cheek. Fuck you.
Okay. Alright, well, I'm gonna cut the record. Anyway. Thank you.
Oh wait, you're recording now?
Yeah.
Please remove that.
I'm sorry, I don't have any
Best-
beeps. It's just gonna have to go on YouTube.
There will be excerpts published later.
Yeah. The duck said this. It's perfect.
Good title for an excerpt series, The Duck's Head.
True.
I really never. Actually, I might fix this after up at some point.